In early December of 1942, a narrow mountain passage in Tunisia waited in silence. The ground looked plain, dust lay flat, stones rested where they always had, nothing warned of danger. Yet this quiet stretch of earth was about to change how an entire battalion understood war. Private First Class Samuel Garrett had been awake since before dawn. Cold air bit at his fingers as he crouched beside the work he had built with his own hands. He did not pace, he did not pray, he simply watched. His eyes moved across the ground as if reading a familiar book. Every dip, every shadow, every line of dirt mattered. To anyone else, the place looked foolish. 3 rough piles of soil sat in the middle of the pass. Scrap wood and metal were partly buried. One patch of ground looked smoother than the rest, almost too neat. Soldiers had laughed at it for days. They had given it a name. Garrett's Gopher Mound. The name spread faster than the desert wind. 9 days earlier, Garrett had started digging. He worked alone most of the time. He used a shovel, his hands, and whatever scraps he could find. No one helped. No one believed in it. Men stopped to watch him only to mock him. They asked if he was building a farm. They joked about planting corn. They said a tank would crush it like sand. Garrett never argued. He never raised his voice. He just kept working. His silence made the jokes sharper. Some men said he was stubborn. Others said he was slow. A few said he was dangerous. Officers did not like what he built. It did not match the manuals. It did not look like a defense. The first to speak against it was First Sergeant Raymond Kowalski. He was loud and proud of it. On the 8th day, he stood on the dirt piles and laughed. He said the idea was useless. He said it would not stop a small car, let alone a tank. His words echoed through the pass. Soldiers laughed with him. The battalion commander, Lieutenant Colonel Marcus Patton, was worse. He did not laugh, he frowned. He said the army already had proper weapons. Mines, guns, rocket launchers. He told Garrett that dirt piles were not defense. He warned him that bad ideas could get men killed. Those words stayed with Garrett not because they scared him, but because they showed how little others saw. They saw dirt, he saw movement, they saw shape, he saw behavior. Garrett grew up far from war. His home was a wide ranch in South Dakota. Land stretched farther than fences. The ground taught lessons. Animals moved in patterns, predators followed habits. His father taught him to watch before acting, to wait, to understand where something would step before trying to stop it. Ammo was expensive on the ranch. A missed shot cost money, a bad choice meant loss. Garrett learned that strength did not matter as much as timing. You did not chase animals, you let them come to you. You placed simple traps where they would walk without thinking. When Garrett arrived in North Africa, tanks did not scare him. They reminded him of heavy animals, big, loud, strong, but limited. He watched German armor move across open land. He noticed how drivers avoided rough ground. He saw how they chose smooth paths. He learned that tanks hated risk more than speed. When he studied Fed Pass, he saw a perfect funnel. Sharp slopes boxed the road. Only one line felt safe. Any tank entering would choose it. Not because it was forced, but because it looked right. Garrett walked the pass again and again. He followed the smooth ground. He imagined himself behind narrow vision slots. He pictured correcting course. He traced the path with his boots. Every step confirmed the same truth. The first tank would always go the same way, so he began to dig. He did not build a wall, he did not dig a trench, he shaped choices. The 3 dirt mounds were not meant to block. They were meant to guide. A driver would see uneven ground and drift away, just a little, enough to line up with the smooth patch beyond. That smooth patch was the heart of it all. Under it, Garrett carved a pit deep enough to swallow the front of a tank. He built a wooden frame that could hold a man but not a machine. He covered it with canvas, then real soil, real stones. He matched color and texture until it vanished. Under the pit he placed charges, not army issue, captured explosives. He shaped copper cones by hand, he aimed them upward, he tested angles again and again, he measured weight and pressure. He calculated how much force would break the frame. Garrett knew belly armor was thin, he knew gravity would tilt the tank, he knew once the nose dropped the machine would be helpless. He added more charges around the pit. These were backups. If something went wrong, they would finish the job. His father's rule stayed in his mind. A good trap must work even when something fails. By the 9th day, rumors reached headquarters. German tanks were gathering, more than a dozen. Fed Pass was their likely path. Suddenly, Garrett's work was not just strange, it was in the way. That night, Colonel Patton summoned him. The order was clear: fill the holes, remove the dirt, clear the field for guns. Garrett stood straight and listened. He said nothing, he was given 24 hours. Garrett returned to the pass after dark, stars hung low. Wind whispered through rock. He worked alone. He checked every board, every wire, every shadow. He erased footprints. He knew the risk. Disobeying orders meant punishment, but moving the trap meant failure. At dawn, an orderly came for him. Garrett walked to headquarters expecting charges. Instead, he was asked one question: did you dismantle it? Garrett answered calmly, no, sir. Silence filled the tent. The colonel studied him closely, then he said something unexpected. "Sit down, explain it to me." Garrett took a breath, he began to speak. And as he did, the future of the pass hung on every word. The explanation had begun, but the decision was still far from made. Garrett sat on a wooden crate inside the command tent. Dust floated in the thin light from a hanging lamp. Maps of the pass lay spread across the table. Lieutenant Colonel Patton stood over them with crossed arms. His face showed doubt but also curiosity. He had expected excuses, instead he was about to hear a lesson. Garrett spoke slowly, his voice stayed steady. He did not try to impress, he simply explained. He began with the dirt mounds. He said they were not walls, they were not meant to stop anything, they were signals. A tank driver looked ahead through a narrow slit. Uneven ground felt risky. Smooth ground felt safe. The mounds existed to make the driver choose safety without thinking. Patton leaned forward slightly. Garrett continued. Each mound shifted the tank's path by only a few degrees. One correction led to another. By the time the tank passed the third mound, it was already lined up with the smooth patch ahead. The driver would feel confident. He would keep moving. Then Garrett spoke about the ground itself. He pointed to a hand-drawn sketch. He explained pressure. A tank weighed many tons. That weight pressed down through tracks. The wooden frame beneath the soil could not hold it. It was not meant to. It was meant to fail at the exact moment the tank committed fully. He described the drop. When the frame collapsed, the tank's front would fall. Gravity would tilt the hull forward. At that angle, the bottom armor became exposed. That armor was thin, weaker than the sides, weaker than the front. Garrett had measured the angles again and again. He knew where the tank would stop. Patton asked questions. How deep was the pit? How strong was the wood? Garrett answered each one without pause. He had lived with these numbers for days. He knew them by heart. Then came the explosives. Garrett explained how shaped charges worked. He did not use complex terms. He said the blast focused upward. He said the copper cone turned force into a narrow jet. He said that jet moved faster than bullets and burned through steel. He told Patton there were 4 main charges, all aimed upward, all placed so they would fire at the same time. He explained where each jet would strike. One at the driver's position, one near the commander, one near the ammunition, one as backup. Patton's jaw tightened at that last part. He understood what ammunition fire meant inside a tank. Garrett then spoke about the extra charges. 6 more buried around the pit, linked by tension wires. If the tank shifted or tried to move, they would trigger. If the first blast did not finish the job, the second would. He ended with the terrain. He stood and traced the pass on the map. He showed the slopes, the rocks, the narrow floor. He explained that tanks would not climb the sides, they would not risk slipping. There was only one path that felt right. When Garrett finished, the tent was quiet. Patton did not speak right away. He looked at the map, then at Garrett, then back at the map. Finally, he straightened. He said the trap would stay, but his voice carried steel. If it failed, Garrett would face court-martial. No excuses, no mercy. Garrett accepted this without protest. He saluted and left. Word spread fast. The jokes changed tone. They did not stop, but they softened. Some men stopped laughing altogether. Others watched the pass more closely now. The idea that one private might be right unsettled them. The next 3 days moved slowly. German engines were heard in the distance. Patrols reported armor gathering. The air felt tight, everyone prepared for a fight. Garrett returned to the trap again and again. He adjusted soil color. He smoothed edges. He tested wires. He lay flat on the ground and viewed the site from low angles. He climbed higher to see how shadows fell at dawn. He built a shallow observation hole nearby. From there, he could see the approach without being seen. He wrote notes in a small book, not feelings, just numbers, distances, timing. Some soldiers still mocked him. One shouted that 5 tanks would crush his dirt. Garrett answered calmly, it only needed to stop the first. On the evening of December 6th, final confirmation arrived. The attack would come at dawn, artillery first, tanks after. That night, Garrett barely slept. He lay still, listening to wind and distant engines. He thought of his father, of traps in open fields, of waiting. Before dawn, he moved into position. The moon gave just enough light. The pass looked empty. Quiet, normal. Then the artillery began. Shells crashed along the ridges. The ground shook. Dust filled the air. Garrett pressed low. He listened for damage. He waited for silence. When the guns stopped, the world felt frozen. Then he heard it. A low rumble, heavy, steady, tanks. 5 shapes emerged from the dark. Panzer IVs moving in line. The lead tank rolled forward with confidence. The commander scanned ahead. The driver chose the smooth path. Garrett watched every movement. His chest felt tight, but his mind stayed clear. The first mound came into view. The tank drifted slightly, just as planned. The second mound, another small correction. The third, now the tank was lined up perfectly. It rolled closer. 50 meters, 40, the ground looked safe. The trap waited. The tank reached the edge of the smooth patch. For a brief moment, nothing happened. And then the ground began to give way. The ground failed without warning. 1 second, the tank rolled forward. The next, the earth beneath it collapsed inward. The sound was sharp and wrong, wood cracked, dirt fell, metal screamed as the front of the Panzer dropped hard into the hidden pit. The tank's nose plunged down. Its rear lifted off the ground, tracks spun in the air, throwing dust and stones. For a brief moment, the massive machine hung at a steep angle, frozen between balance and disaster. Garrett's breath caught in his chest. Not from fear, but from focus. This was the moment he had measured for. This was the angle he had drawn again and again in his notebook. Gravity finished the work. The tank slammed forward. Its weight crushed the broken frame beneath it. The hull, locked in place, tilted sharply downward. Inside, the crew was thrown forward. Nothing about the tank's design could save it now. Then the first charges fired. 4 shaped blasts erupted from the bottom of the pit almost at the same instant. There was no warning sound, no long explosion, just sudden violence. The copper jets punched upward through steel as if it were thin cloth. One jet tore through the driver's position. Another ripped into the lower turret. A third struck near the ammunition racks. Heat and pressure filled the interior in less than a heartbeat. Inside the tank, rounds ignited. Fire raced through confined space. The force had nowhere to go but out. The turret lifted. It did not roll or slide. It was thrown. It flew through the air like a broken crown, spinning once before crashing down far from the wreck. Flames burst from every opening. The hull split. Metal peeled outward. Fuel ignited. The blast lit the pass in orange and white. Smoke and debris shot upward. Shockwaves rippled through the narrow corridor. Garrett felt the heat on his face even from his position. He stayed still. He watched. 5 seconds later, the backup charges fired. 6 more explosions rang out around the pit. Dirt and rock exploded outward. The ground widened and collapsed further. Any movement inside the wreck was erased. The tank became a burning ruin. From first collapse to final blast, only seconds had passed, less than half a minute. The silence that followed felt heavier than the explosions. Garrett wrote one short line in his notebook. Primary trap successful. But there was no time to rest. The second tank in the column stopped hard. Its commander stared ahead at the burning wreck. To him, there was no clear cause, no mine crater, no gunfire. The lead tank had simply vanished into fire. The remaining tanks halted. Engines idled. Smoke drifted across the pass. The ground ahead looked normal except for the wreck. No wires, no signs, just death where safety should have been. Confusion spread through the column. The second commander made a choice. He would not drive forward. He turned left toward the slope, searching for a way around the wreck. Garrett had expected this. The dirt mounds had not only guided the first tank, they shaped the next choice too. The bypass path felt safe. It looked open. It led straight toward another smooth patch of ground. The second pit, the tank moved cautiously. Tracks crunched over stone. It crept forward, angled away from the wreck, trying to escape the invisible threat. Its front tracks reached the edge of the hidden cover. Again, there was a moment of calm. Then the ground gave way. The second tank dropped. Wood shattered, dirt collapsed. The hull tilted forward sharply. Gravity locked it in place. The shaped charges fired. Another blast tore through the pass. Another fireball rose. Another turret lifted and crashed down. Flames rolled outward. Smoke thickened. Burning fuel ran across the ground. 2 tanks destroyed. The remaining 3 reversed at once. Engines roared. Tracks scraped backward in panic. No orders were needed. No command was given. They wanted distance. They wanted safety. The pass filled with smoke and fire. Burning wrecks blocked the path. Heat shimmered in the air. Garrett watched the retreat through drifting ash. His hands shook slightly now, not from fear but from release. The system had worked exactly as calculated. Behind him, American soldiers slowly rose from their positions. No one spoke at first. They stared at the burning steel in disbelief. First Sergeant Kowalski stood frozen. His mouth hung open. The jokes he had made over 9 days echoed painfully in his mind. He had seen tanks destroyed before, but never like this. Never this fast, never without a single shot fired. He walked toward Garrett's position slowly, as if the ground might still betray him. "Garrett," he said at last. His voice sounded strange to his own ears. "How many?" Garrett did not look up from his notebook. "2, he answered calmly. "Both destroyed." Kowalski swallowed. He stared at the wreckage again. Smoke curled upward. Ammunition popped inside the ruins. "I was wrong," the sergeant said quietly. Garrett closed his notebook. He nodded once, nothing more. Word spread through the battalion like fire. Soldiers gathered along the ridge. Officers arrived. They whispered. They pointed. They tried to understand what they were seeing. Lieutenant Colonel Patton arrived soon after. He walked the site in silence. He examined the collapsed pit, the broken wood, the exposed wiring. Everything matched Garrett's explanation. He stopped near the edge of the crater and looked at the young private. "You were right," he said simply. That afternoon, reports came in. German armor had pulled back. No further advance was planned through the pass. The attack was over. But Patton was already thinking ahead. If one trap could do this, what could several do? 2 days later, supplies arrived: lumber, canvas, wire. Explosives, Patton handed them directly to Garrett. "You're being promoted," he said, "and reassigned. Your job is to build more of these." Garrett accepted the orders without pride. He studied the supplies, he calculated quietly. "3 full systems," he said, "if I have help." Patton nodded. "You'll have it." The helpers assigned to him were familiar faces, men who had laughed the loudest, men who had doubted the most. They did not laugh now. Garrett began teaching. Not with speeches, with simple rules. Watch the ground, think like the machine, hide everything, make danger look safe. The men listened. The first new trap took shape along a northern route. It was better than the first, cleaner, smarter. Improved by experience. Garrett worked day and night, his hands cracked, his eyes burned, but his mind stayed sharp. On the morning of January 3rd, German tanks approached that route. The trap waited. And history prepared to repeat itself. The northern route looked harmless at first glance. It curved gently between low ridges and broken stone. The ground there felt firm underfoot. To an untrained eye, it was safe. To Garrett, it was another pattern waiting to be used. He had studied this approach after the fight at Fed Pass. Intelligence reports suggested the Germans might try to flank the battalion. Garrett agreed. Tanks avoided places where fear lived. After 2 sudden losses, the pass itself had become frightening. The northern route looked easier. That made it dangerous. Garrett redesigned the system with small improvements. He did not rush. He walked the ground for hours before digging. He followed the smoothest track again and again. He imagined how a tank would correct its course when faced with rubble or slope. He placed markers in his mind, not on the ground. This new trap used 2 pits instead of 1. The first was placed where the lead tank would feel most confident. The second sat farther along the likely bypass line. Garrett did not guess the distance. He measured it based on how tanks turned when avoiding obstacles. He had seen it before. He trusted the pattern. The men working with him had changed. Corporal Murphy no longer joked. He focused on camouflage. He studied dirt color and shadow like an artist. Private Shaw handled the wood frame. He learned quickly. The same hands that once pointed and laughed now worked carefully and in silence. Garrett taught without anger. He corrected gently. He repeated one rule often. If it looks wrong, it will be seen. They learned to blend edges, to break straight lines, to hide work inside nature. By the time the trap was finished, even Garrett had trouble seeing it. That was how he knew it was ready. On the morning of January 3rd, a patrol reported movement. 3 Panzer IVs were advancing along the northern route. The battalion prepared to engage. Guns were ready, mines were checked. Guns were ready, mines were checked. Garrett moved to his observation point. He lay low, heart steady, eyes fixed forward. The tanks appeared just after sunrise. Dust rose beneath their tracks. The lead tank moved confidently. The commander scanned ahead. The driver followed the smooth ground. The first pit waited. The tank reached it and vanished in a roar of earth and fire. The shaped charges did their work. Steel split, flames erupted. The crew had no chance. The second tank reacted exactly as Garrett predicted. It swerved to bypass the wreck. It turned where the ground looked safer. The second pit collapsed beneath it. Another explosion shook the valley. Fire rose. Smoke rolled across the route. The third tank stopped short. Its commander hesitated. He tried to reverse. Debris blocked the path. A piece of wreckage jammed beneath the tracks. The tank stalled. American guns finished it moments later. 3 tanks neutralized. No American casualties. The battalion stared in stunned silence. This was no accident. This was a system. News traveled fast up the chain of command. Officers from other units came to see the site. Engineers asked questions. They sketched diagrams. They measured pits. They examined fragments of copper and steel. Garrett answered when asked. He never exaggerated. He never claimed credit. He spoke of angles, of habits, of ground. Lieutenant Colonel Patton read the reports carefully. The language changed. The tone shifted. This was no longer an odd success. It was proof. A third trap was ordered. This one would cover a western approach. The terrain there was wider. Less confined, more difficult. Garrett accepted the challenge. He studied the area for 2 full days before touching a shovel. This time he planned 3 pits, not in a line, in a triangle. The idea was simple. If the first tank fell, the second would try one path. If it failed, the third would choose another. Each choice led to a trap. Escape required leaving the road entirely. That meant rocks, slopes, track damage. The work was harder here. The ground fought back. Rock layers slowed digging. Camouflage was harder to match. Shadows shifted through the day. Garrett adapted. He adjusted pit depth. He changed mound placement. He refined angles. He worked until his hands bled. He slept little. The men followed him without complaint. On January 11th, a German reconnaissance patrol moved into the western approach. 4 Panzer IVs advanced in loose formation. They were cautious now, too cautious. The first tank rolled onto the center pit and exploded instantly. The second tank turned right. The ground collapsed beneath it. The third turned left. Another pit swallowed it. The fourth panicked. It reversed fast. Its rear slammed into a large boulder. Metal screeched. The transmission failed. The tank was immobilized. 7 tanks destroyed across 3 trap systems. German radio traffic intercepted later revealed panic. Orders were confused. Commanders argued. Reports spoke of invisible weapons, of ground that attacked without warning. The Germans stopped using mountain passes. They avoided narrow terrain. Fear had reshaped their behavior. Garrett did not celebrate. He took notes. The army began formal studies. Engineers interviewed him. Intelligence officers listened carefully. Diagrams were redrawn. A manual began to take shape. It listed principles: behavioral prediction, visual deception, redundancy. Psychology, one line stood out. Innovation may come from unexpected experience. Garrett's name spread beyond the battalion, but he stayed the same. Quiet, focused, practical. When the campaign moved on, he moved with it. Sicily, Italy. France, he continued to advise, to teach, to observe. After the war, he returned home. He ran the ranch. He fixed fences. He solved problems the same way he always had. Years later, a historian asked him why no one else thought of it. Garrett answered simply, "They fought tanks head-on, I watched where they stepped." The story of Fed Pass became legend. A farm boy, dirt, wood, fire, fear. But even now, historians debate one question. How many other simple ideas were ignored because they did not look right? And how many battles were lost before someone finally listened? The fires at the western approach burned for hours. Thick smoke drifted across the hills and settled into every low place. Twisted metal cracked and popped as heat worked through it. No German force came near. The ground itself had earned a reputation. Inside the American lines, the mood had changed completely. Soldiers no longer joked about dirt piles. They spoke in low voices. They pointed at the pits with care, as if the ground might still be listening. What had begun as mockery had turned into respect mixed with unease. Lieutenant Colonel Patton called for reports from every unit that had seen the traps in action. He read each one slowly. The language was no longer casual. Words like improvised disappeared. They were replaced with system and method. This mattered to Patton. Language shaped how ideas lived or died inside the army. Engineers arrived 2 days later. They brought measuring tools and notebooks. Some wore expressions of doubt. Others looked excited. They crawled into pits. They tested remaining wood. They collected pieces of copper shaped by explosive force. They argued quietly among themselves. Garrett answered their questions with patience. He explained again and again that the traps were not about strength. They were about choice. He said tanks did not think like men. They followed comfort. They followed habit. They trusted the ground. One engineer asked why the pits were placed where they were. Garrett answered by asking him where he would drive if he could not see clearly and wanted to stay safe. The engineer paused, then nodded. The army began to formalize what Garrett had done. They did not call it farmer tricks. They called it behavioral channeling. They wrote it down. They drew clean diagrams that looked nothing like the messy ground where it had first worked. Garrett noticed this but did not comment. A training group was formed. Garrett was ordered to instruct it. He stood before soldiers who outranked him and spoke in simple terms. He did not use long words. He said, "Watch the ground. Watch the enemy, build where they will go, not where you want them." Some listened closely. Some struggled. Not everyone could think this way. Garrett understood that too. Not every man had grown up watching animals move across open land. German reaction reports arrived weeks later. Intelligence officers translated them carefully. The tone was tense. Fear ran through the words. German commanders believed the Americans had developed a new class of hidden weapon. They believed it could not be detected. They believed it attacked from below. That belief changed German movement. Tanks slowed. Recon units hesitated. Routes once considered safe were avoided. Supply lines stretched. Decisions took longer. Fear did more damage than any explosion. Garrett read none of these reports. He focused on his work. He refined details. He improved camouflage methods. He learned how different soil types behaved under weight. Sand failed differently than clay. Rock needed different framing. He adjusted. The war moved north. New terrain brought new challenges. Narrow villages, stone roads, fields broken by walls. Garrett adapted his thinking. He taught others how to do the same. He never asked for recognition. He did not seek promotion. When it came, he accepted it quietly. Staff Sergeant Garrett sounded strange to his ears. At night, he sometimes thought about the first trap, about the moment when the ground collapsed, about the thin line between confidence and disaster. He knew it could have failed. He knew how close it had been. That knowledge kept him careful. As the months passed, the Army produced a manual. It was thick, 91 pages. It carried a formal title, but at its core were simple ideas pulled from Garrett's notes. Watch behavior, hide your work, build twice in case once fails. One paragraph stood out to many readers. It stated that civilian experience could provide insight equal to formal training. For some officers, that sentence was harder to accept than any battlefield loss. The manual spread slowly. Old habits resisted change, but success spoke louder than tradition. German prisoners captured later were questioned, some spoke openly, they described fear of narrow roads, of mountain passes, of ground that looked safe. One said they feared the earth itself. Garrett heard about this years later, he said nothing. When the war ended, he returned home. The ranch looked smaller than he remembered, the land felt familiar under his boots. He fixed fences. He mended tools, he watched animals move across open fields, neighbors asked about the war, he gave short answers, he spoke more about weather than about battles. In time, historians found him. They wanted details, they wanted drama. They wanted a hero story. Garrett disappointed them. He spoke plainly. He said he only noticed patterns others ignored. One historian asked him if he felt angry about being mocked at first. Garrett thought for a long moment. Then he shook his head. They didn't see what I saw, he said, that's all. The story of Fed Pass entered military schools. Cadets studied it, some admired it, some questioned it, a few truly understood it. The world moved on. Technology advanced. Weapons changed, but the lesson stayed hidden in plain sight. Strength matters, but understanding matters more. Garrett lived a long, quiet life. When he passed, there were no headlines, no grand ceremonies. But his work lived on in manuals, in doctrine, and in the habits of soldiers who learned to watch the ground before charging forward. The dirt piles were long gone. Wind and rain erased them, but the idea remained. That sometimes the simplest thing placed in the right spot could stop something that seemed unstoppable. And somewhere on another battlefield, someone was about to ignore a strange idea that did not look right at all. Years after the war, many officers remembered the traps as if they had appeared fully formed. They forgot the doubt. They forgot the laughter. They remembered only the burning tanks and the sudden silence that followed. But inside the army, change never moved quickly. Ideas had to fight their own battles. During the later campaigns in Europe, Garrett was moved between units. Sometimes he advised engineers. Sometimes he trained small teams. Sometimes he simply walked the ground with officers who wanted to understand why a place felt dangerous or safe. He never carried rank like armor. He spoke the same way to privates and colonels. In one village, an officer asked him why a road felt wrong even though it looked clear. Garrett knelt, touched the dirt, and pointed to a shallow dip filled with loose gravel. Tracks will slide here, he said. They'll slow down. That's when people panic. The officer nodded, uneasy. Garrett did not always build traps now. Sometimes his work was to stop others from building bad ones. He warned against patterns that looked too neat. He told men not to trust straight lines. He said symmetry caught the eye, some listened, some did not. In one case, a unit ignored his advice. They placed obstacles where doctrine said they should go, not where tanks would choose to move. When German armor advanced, the tanks bypassed the defenses with ease. Losses followed. Garrett was not there to say anything. He wrote one short note in his book and closed it. The war rewarded speed and power. Garrett worked in the spaces between. He slowed enemies by making them doubt. He caused hesitation where confidence once lived. Intercepted German messages continued to mention hidden threats. Commanders warned crews to avoid narrow routes. Drivers were told to stop more often. Recon units were pushed farther ahead. All of this took time. Time saved lives on the other side. Garrett understood this effect deeply. On the ranch, animals that feared traps avoided entire fields. They took longer paths. They wasted energy. Fear changed behavior more than pain ever did. In France, a young lieutenant asked him why fear mattered so much. Garrett answered with a simple example. If you think the ground might kill you, he said, you stop trusting it. And when you stop trusting the ground, you stop moving. The lieutenant remembered that. By late 1944, Garrett's name appeared in internal reports. Not in headlines, in footnotes. Consult Garrett. Review with Garrett. He became a quiet reference point. Still, there were limits. Some generals dismissed his ideas as situational. They said tanks would adapt. They said technology would solve the problem. Garrett did not argue. He knew adaptation took time, and time was always short in war. One evening, after a long day of planning, Garrett sat alone outside a command post. Rain fell softly, mud clung to his boots. He stared at the ground without thinking. He wondered how many ideas were buried like his first pit, hidden by habit, covered by certainty. He thought of the men who had laughed. Of Kowalski's face when the tanks burned. Of Patton's silence when the reports came in. Those moments mattered. They showed how quickly belief could collapse. After the war ended, formal evaluations were written. Committees debated language. They argued about credit. Some wanted to frame the traps as a one-time solution. Others pushed for broader lessons. Garrett was invited to speak once more, this time to a room full of senior officers. The walls were clean. The floor was polished, no dirt anywhere. He stood at the front and spoke plainly. He said machines followed rules. He said people wrote manuals, but habits wrote movement. He said the ground told the truth if you listened. Some officers nodded, some frowned. One asked if this thinking could apply beyond tanks. Garrett paused, then he said yes. He said people moved the same way. They chose paths that felt safe. They followed patterns without knowing it. They avoided what scared them. The room was quiet. That idea unsettled them more than any trap. After that talk, Garrett was never asked to speak again. His message had landed too close to comfort. He returned home not long after. Civilian life welcomed him without ceremony. The ranch needed work. Fences had fallen, tools were rusted, the land waited. Garrett found peace in simple tasks. Mending wire, clearing brush, watching clouds, he slept deeply again. But the war did not fully leave him. Sometimes he woke before dawn thinking about shadows, about angles, about how light changed ground. When neighbors asked him about metals, he shrugged. He said metals were heavy and did not fix fences. Years passed, technology advanced. New tanks rolled off lines, heavier, faster, smarter, armor thickened, weapons grew stronger. Some believed Garrett's ideas no longer mattered. Then new conflicts began in places with narrow roads, mountain passes, and broken terrain. Old lessons returned. Quietly, young engineers found the old manual. They read the 91 pages, some laughed at the drawings, some skimmed. A few stopped and reread the same lines twice. Those few began to watch the ground differently. Garrett never knew their names. Late in his life, a reporter asked him one final question. Did he believe the army had truly learned from Fed Pass? Garrett looked out over his land. Wind moved the grass. Animals followed familiar paths along the fence line. Some did, he said, some didn't. The reporter asked which mattered more. Garrett smiled faintly. The ones who didn't, he said, they're the reason the lesson still matters. What? That night the sky was clear. Stars spread wide above the ranch. Garrett sat on his porch and listened to the quiet. He knew that somewhere someone was facing a problem that looked impossible, something heavy, something loud, something everyone said could not be stopped. And he wondered if that person would look at it head-on, or if they would look down at the ground and see what others missed. Because the next breakthrough, like the first, would come from a place no one was watching. In the years after Garrett returned home, the world tried to move forward. Cities were rebuilt, roads were repaired, armies changed uniforms and weapons. Many believed the lessons of the last war were settled and understood. But real understanding rarely spreads fast. Military schools taught doctrine, cadets memorized rules. They studied diagrams drawn with clean lines and perfect angles. They learned how battles were supposed to happen. Garrett's work was there, but often buried in side chapters or case studies. Important but not central, some instructors treated the story of Fed Pass as an odd moment, a lucky success, a rare case that could not be repeated. They preferred lessons that fit neatly into existing systems. Others saw something deeper. A few young officers became quiet readers. They paid attention to the sections about terrain and behavior. They noticed how often the manual spoke about prediction instead of reaction. These officers began to walk training grounds differently. They stopped standing tall. They crouched. They traced paths with their eyes. One of them later wrote that Garrett's lesson was not about traps. It was about humility, about accepting that the enemy, the ground, and even one's own habits could teach more than any rulebook. Garrett never read that report. Back on the ranch, life moved with the seasons. Winter brought silence and long nights. Summer brought work and dust. Garrett aged slowly. His movement stayed careful. He still noticed small things, a broken fence post, a trail forming where animals crossed, a low spot where water gathered after rain. Visitors came less often now. The war felt distant to most people. New concerns filled the news. New threats replaced old ones, yet the pattern remained. Whenever machines grew stronger, people trusted them more. And whenever trust grew too strong, blind spots appeared. Garrett's health began to fail in his later years. His hands shook slightly when he held tools. His steps slowed. Still, he walked the land every morning. He believed problems revealed themselves to those who showed up early. One evening, he found a young neighbor stuck with a broken tractor. The machine was heavy. The ground beneath it was soft from rain. The wheels spun uselessly. The neighbor cursed the machine. He talked about more power, bigger tires. Garrett watched quietly. Then he pointed to a narrow strip of firmer ground nearby. "Back it that way," he said. "Don't fight it." What? The tractor rolled free with ease. The neighbor stared at him. "How did you see that?" Garrett smiled. "The ground always tells you," he said. That moment passed without ceremony, but it held the same truth as Fed Pass. Strength alone rarely solved the real problem. As Garrett's life drew closer to its end, interest in his story rose again. Historians revisited older records. New conflicts made old lessons relevant. Narrow roads, urban fighting, confined terrain. Once again, movement mattered more than force. Some articles praised him, others debated him, a few misunderstood him entirely. Garrett did not care. When he passed away, there were no grand announcements. A small notice ran in a local paper. It mentioned his service briefly. It spoke more about the ranch, but in military archives his name remained, quietly referenced, never flashy, always present. Decades after Fed Pass, a modern officer stood in a distant mountain region. His unit faced a problem that felt familiar: heavy vehicles, narrow paths, an enemy that relied on speed and confidence. The officer had studied many doctrines. None fit the situation well. Late one night he found an old case study. He read about dirt mounds, about hidden pits, about shaping choice instead of forcing action. The language felt old, but the idea felt alive. He closed the book and went outside. He walked the road ahead. He noticed where vehicles naturally drifted. He saw where the ground felt safe. He did not copy Garrett's traps. He did not need to. He understood the lesson. Back in South Dakota, Garrett's ranch changed hands. New fences were built. New tools filled the barn. The land remained the same. Wind still moved the grass in familiar waves. Animals still followed old paths. If someone had stood there and watched carefully, they would have seen it. Behavior did not change easily. It repeated itself. That was the quiet power of Garrett's work. It did not depend on time or place. It depended on understanding. Wars ended. New ones began. Technology rose and fell, but people and machines continued to move in patterns, and the ground continued to guide them. Most would never hear Garrett's name. That did not matter. His idea did not need fame to survive. It only needed someone somewhere to stop and look down, because the most dangerous thing on a battlefield was not the enemy's weapon. It was the assumption that the enemy would act differently than before. And as long as that assumption existed, Garrett's lesson would remain unfinished. The story was not over yet. It was only waiting for the next person who dared to see the ground as it truly was. The story of Fed Pass did not end with Garrett's death. It continued quietly, carried forward by people who never knew his face and never heard his voice. They inherited the idea without realizing where it came from. In later years, military planners spoke often about technology. Sensors, drones, precision weapons, data. They believed better tools would remove uncertainty from the battlefield. Many thought surprise was a problem of the past. Yet uncertainty never left. It only changed shape. In training exercises, units with advanced equipment still made the same mistakes. They followed the easiest routes. They trusted what looked safe. They avoided what looked rough. Instructors noticed this pattern again and again. Some called it human nature. A few remembered an old lesson. Those few taught others to slow down, to study terrain before moving, to ask simple questions. Where would I go if I were tired? Where would I go if I were scared? Where would I go if I could not see clearly? The answers were always the same. Garrett's approach was never about explosives or pits. Those were tools. The real weapon was understanding. Once a person understood behavior, the rest followed. In one modern conflict, an armored unit stalled for hours in a narrow valley. No mines were present. No shots were fired. The drivers simply refused to move forward. The ground felt wrong. Shadows looked strange. Confidence vanished. Later analysis showed nothing dangerous had been there at all. Fear alone had done the work. That moment echoed Fed Pass more than any explosion ever could. Military historians debated this openly. Some argued that Garrett's ideas only worked against older machines. Others pointed out that modern systems still relied on human judgment, and humans still trusted comfort. One historian wrote that Garrett did not defeat tanks, he defeated certainty. That sentence became quietly famous. At the ranch, long after Garrett was gone, a new owner found an old notebook in a drawer. The pages were yellowed. The writing was plain: numbers, sketches, short notes, nothing dramatic. One page held a single sentence written in careful letters. Things move where they feel safe. The owner did not know its importance. He put the notebook back and closed the drawer. Some ideas do not announce themselves, they wait. The world continued to change. New threats emerged, new weapons appeared, old ones faded, but one truth stayed constant. People looked for danger where danger usually lived. They ignored places that looked ordinary. That blind spot never disappeared. In military education, instructors still struggled with this. Students wanted rules. They wanted certainty, they wanted clear answers. Garrett's lesson offered none of that. It demanded patience, observation, humility. It asked soldiers to admit they did not fully control the battlefield. That was hard. But those who accepted it gained something rare. They learned to shape events instead of chasing them. They learned to let the enemy make the mistake. In quiet moments, some officers spoke about Fed Pass not as a battle, but as a warning. They said it showed how fragile confidence could be, how quickly belief collapsed when the ground betrayed you. They said the most dangerous enemy was the one who understood you better than you understood yourself. Garrett had understood that early. He never saw himself as clever, he simply paid attention. He did not chase power. He waited for it to step into the wrong place. That patience saved lives. In the end, that was his true legacy: not burning tanks, not manuals, not promotions, but a way of thinking that valued understanding over force, a way of seeing what others ignored. Somewhere, at some future time, a young soldier would face a problem everyone said could not be solved. They would hear laughter. They would hear doubt. They would be told their idea looked stupid. If they remembered Fed Pass even faintly, they might pause. They might look down. They might ask where the enemy would step without thinking. And that pause could change everything. Because history is not only shaped by generals and weapons, it is shaped by the quiet moments when someone chooses to observe instead of react, by the person who understands that strength does not always win. Sometimes the ground does. And the next breakthrough will begin the same way the last one did, unnoticed, untrusted, and waiting for someone brave enough to believe in it.